Today we're going to pick up where we were last time, and we were talking some about carbon cycling. We were talking some about organismal distribution, and so we're going to pick up again here with some organismal distribution ideas. Some of these terms are thrown around casually when people are talking about how organisms are distributed, but it's important to really dial in what we mean. So you can think of each organism, each plant, each dominant plant, each organism within a forest as having kind of an optimal tolerance range for a variety of different environmental factors. So there's a place where a given plant or a given organism would be performing at its most optimum. And then there are places where the organism might be able to hang in there, but it's really under suboptimal conditions. And this is really important because often models that show species distribution assume that wherever species are is where they're performing at their best. Well, or growing at their best or reproducing at their best. But in fact, species can often hang on in suboptimal conditions for long periods of time. So just because an organism is found in a location doesn't mean that's its optimal location. But let's go with this model. So if we think of an environmental gradient, this could be moisture, it could be heat, it could be freezing temperatures in the winter. You can think of that environmental gradient going from low conditions to high conditions, whatever this is. And then you can think of an organism's population size going from low to high. And so then you have this range, basically a normal distribution curve where you would expect an organism to occur. Now, in fact, in reality, we know that often this is not a normal distribution curve. It can be skewed left or right, depending on particularities of an organism's tolerance for a given environmental limiter. But let's go with this idea. So, for example, here's an organism. It's just another graph showing pH and temperature now as our environmental gradient. And you can imagine an organism existing in its optimal pH and its optimal temperature. On the edges or the margins of that organism's distribution, you still find the organism, but it's in kind of a marginal niche. And so we call this an environmental niche of an organism. And we can talk about this in terms of two important terms, fundamental and realized niche space. So an organism's fundamental niche is where it can occur based on its own environmental tolerances, absent any other interacting factors or interacting organisms, right? And there's kind of a zone of physiological stress on the margins of where that organism exists. So, but first, let's go back to this idea because we talked about the Clemences in a previous lecture. And the Clemences were fond of this notion that whole communities would phase in and phase out and would be predictable on the landscape, and they would phase in and phase out together so that you had units of organization that were the biological community. If this were true, as we went along any environmental gradient, we would see these paired kind of rainbows of distribution for suites of organisms. If that's not true, we might go with something called the independent plant hypothesis, which is often referred to as Gleasonian, because this was put forth, really championed. It was put forth by many people, but it was really championed by Gleason around the same time as the Clemences, that organisms, Gleason thought, no, organisms all have unique environmental tolerances. They're not dependent on each other. They're not interacting such that they would phase in and phase out together. And so instead of these kind of rainbows of communities that phase in and phase out all at once, instead you have this kind of helter-skelter arrangement of individual species along environmental gradients. And so they phase in and phase out on their own terms. And so if that's true, you see just these independent looking distributions of dominant species or of any given species along an environmental gradient, like the bottom of the graph here. And as we talked about in a previous lecture, this is mostly what the data on the landscape supports, though there are some elements of the Clemency and Community model that persist. So, for example, here's a direct gradient analysis figure from some actual data plotted against a topographic moisture gradient going from mesic or medium moisture sites to xeric sites. And in some cases, you can see community members that seem to be tracking very close to one another. But in many cases, you see individual species. If each species here is represented by a different number, you see them phasing in and out, kind of on their own terms. Under the Clemency model, it would be very handy if it were true, because we notice that there are dominant species on the landscape, say in the Cascades, for example, that phase in and phase out in what seems like banded vegetation patterns as we go up in elevation. This is especially true for forests. So, for example, if low elevation near Portland or near Seattle, you have Douglas fir or western hemlock forests. As you go up in elevation, we encounter zones such as Abies amabilis or silver fir zones, Abies procera or noble fir zones. We start encountering some white pine, and we start encountering things like yellow cedar. So the striped pattern at mid-range there on the west side of the Cascades is a higher elevation forest. Higher still, we get into subalpine forests of mountain hemlock and subalpine fir. So that's Tsuga mertensiana and Abies lasiocarpa. So those are higher elevation forests near tree line, and then we get into alpine communities, snowfields, and glaciers. So we have a really clear banding of different forest types as we go up in elevation. And this is generally true, and it's also generally true that if you stop at discrete points along an elevation gradient, you will notice wholly different communities at each of those points, and so it will seem as if everything phased in and phased out together, like a Clemencean view of communities. So here's an example of an elevation gradient that you could go along yourself if you were going to travel from Olympia up Snoqualmie Pass in the balmy fall weather or late spring weather when you could get up and not have it be too snowy up at high elevation, or even in the middle of the winter, you can knock yourself out. So going from Olympia, you would start in a lowland maritime forest dominated by Abies grandis sometimes, but mostly Douglas fir, western hemlock at climax conditions. Of course, before climax conditions, you might have a whole host of different deciduous species that are dominating, but we would categorize these forests as either western hemlock or Douglas fir forests. We'd only call them Douglas fir forests if we were in what we call a pyroclimax. That is a forest maintained by relatively frequent fire every 100 to 200 years or so. Abies grandis is actually dominant on our landscape here in some forests. And of course, we have western red cedar, Thuya plicata, that is dominant in some of our forests. As we climb up, you would get into a silver fir, more of a western hemlock would stay with you, and sometimes a noble fir dominated forest as you climb up between about 1,000 and 1,400 meters elevation. As you go even further up, we'd get into Abies lasiocarpa, Abies amabilis, silver fir, Tsuga mertensiana, mountain hemlock, and even some yellow cedar dominated forests in the subalpine forest zone. So as you get up near Snoqualmie Pass, you start seeing these species come into dominance as dominant trees in our forests. And then, of course, in the alpine tundra, we start losing our trees altogether. You might have scattered subalpine fir, but largely you have communities that are dominated by grasses, sedges, some things in the sunflower family, perhaps, and other families of dicots. This is a good opportunity to start thinking about our different species of dominant conifers. We think of the Northwest as being dominated by conifers, and many of our climax zones are defined based on conifers. In fact, almost all of them. But of course, we have many deciduous species. So, for example, in the evergreen forest, we have about 50% conifer dominated versus 50% deciduous dominated forests. And that's true for any forest that's under around 100 years in the Puget Sound region, unless it's been heavily planted by conifers after a previous harvest. These conifers have distinct shapes that it's going to be important for you to learn. It's important for you to learn not just their needle forms or their cone forms, which can be really diverse, or their leaf or needle or scale forms, but also the general shape of the overall tree. For example, grand fir, which you can find abundantly near Olympia in Priest Point Park, tends to have a really rounded top versus Douglas fir, which tends to have upsloping branches, which are relatively predictable and kind of a pointier top. So getting to know the structure of the canopy in addition to the needle form of these trees is important for recognizing the dominant trees and helping place yourself in the kind of appropriate climax zone. As we talked about previously, there are multiple maps that will show dominant vegetation zones in terms of climax zones or dominant vegetation that make it look like a Clemencian worldview really works. Here's a map of Oregon with their different colors representing different vegetation types. Here's a simplified map of Washington, which is a little easier to wrap our heads around. There's just fewer zones to talk about here and fewer different vegetation types to work with. So the red here is where a lot of us are spending our time if you're near Evergreen, where here it's broadly classified as Puget Sound, Douglas fir, low flat Puget Sound, maritime or Puget trough forests. This is a gross generalization of our forest types in this area. Our forests are much more diverse than this, and there's much more variability. There's a abundant grand fir in many of these forests. Some of these forests are wetter and some of them are drier. There's even a native ponderosa pine that will be common in many of these forests, largely in the gray area, which isn't in our key down here, but these can be prairies and dry forests with lodgepole pine, ponderosa pine, and prairies in our region. The blue zone is western hemlock, low to mid elevation wet forest zones covering most of western Washington. And then as you go up in elevation, there's predictable transition to silver fir, subalpine forests, and then eventually we get into alpine zones, and then down on the east side, we start to get into a whole different range of forests that are again arranged in bands, going down to the ponderosa pine forests, and then lowland juniper and grassland steppe habitats. This is an image from Mount Rainier. It's a GIS data set that I like to work with sometimes from a series of vegetation surveys that have taken place at Mount Rainier, where individual plots have been measured for dominant species and abundance of all species. The different colors of these dots represents the vegetation type or the dominant vegetation type associated with each plot. And these plots are generally arranged at different elevation bands, and you can see a topography underlaying those dots. And the first thing that might pop out at you is that there's a multitude of different colors here, sometimes all intermixed. And instead of seeing a clear banding of different dot colors as you go up in elevation, there's actually a lot of variability in the colors here represented on the map. And that's representative of the reality that vegetation zones don't actually very cleanly break out with elevation when you're looking on an individual plot scale. And so this is more the Gleasonian reality, that at a broad scale, if we look way back at a big map, we can make maps of vegetation zones that seem pretty accurate. But when we zoom into a local location, the vegetation type is not always perfectly predictable just based on the perceived environmental gradient. So there's a lot of variability out there. Nevertheless, with these vegetation zones, we can make some predictions about how dominant species will respond. And so we'll leave this here with this graph, which comes out of Perry et al., the Forest Ecosystems book. I've added some colors here to make it easier to interpret. So the blue here is a western hemlock zone in western Washington. The green would represent Douglas fir, or I'm sorry, western Washington in Oregon in the Western Cascades. And the red would represent oak savanna, and the yellow would represent grassland. Okay, so on the western slope, with a 2.5-degree climate warming scenario, we are expecting an expansion of oak savanna in western Cascade forests. We're actually expecting somewhat of an expansion of Douglas fir zones at the expense of western hemlock zones. If we expand this to a 5-degree climate warming scenario, we expect a huge expansion of oak savanna types at lowland elevations. We predict some expansion of Douglas fir habitat, and we expect western hemlock dominant forests to decline to almost a third of their present dominance. So major vegetation changes can be predicted and are expected with climate change. Now, this doesn't mean, again, going back to the Gleasonian reality, it doesn't mean that all species are going to change in tandem, but it does mean for some of these dominant species where we have a pretty good handle on what their fundamental niche is on the landscape, we can predict changes in their abundance based on their physiology and their tolerance of this changing environmental condition that is our climate, moisture, and temperature. One final slide here comes from British Columbia. This is an older paper now from the journal Ecology, but this slide and these data come from an analysis in a paper in Ecology in around 2006 that took what we call climate envelopes, which is really what we've been talking. Climate envelopes would be putting an envelope around the current range of a species and then predicting that if the climate changes, you can expect those ranges to change commensurate with what we already see on the landscape. So in this example, the first panel shows 1961 through 1990 climate envelopes for current dominant species. And then the second panel is showing a 2050 approximation of how vegetation zones in British Columbia might shift in response to a changing climate. So notice the change in the pink in particular, that's Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir zone. There's tremendous changes in interior cedar, a little bit of change in coastal western hemlock, which is really interesting. A lot of changes in some of our spruce forests, and just in general changes in our species distribution by 2050 that gets more dramatic. You might notice the expansion of ponderosa pine habitat along the Inside Passage in BC, according to these data, and the expansion of ponderosa pine habitat in much of interior BC. Okay, just something to think about. There are a lot of models and maps out there like this right now, and a lot of uncertainty about what climate changes will mean. When we come back, we'll start with talking about, on a more functional level, how ecosystems change through time. Okay.